It was December 4th, 1995, when the phone jolted me awake at the Grand Prairie Police Department. I'm Detective Alan Patton, a seasoned investigator who thought he'd seen it all, until that morning. The voice on the line trembled, a farmer stammering about a body in his field. "You need to come quick," he said, his words shaking like the wind over the Texas plains. I grabbed my coat and sped to the scene, the weight of dread already sinking into my bones. The field stretched out under a pale, unforgiving sky, a desolate patch of earth just off a lonely road. As I stepped out of the car, the air hit me, cold, sharp, laced with the faint metallic tang of blood. Then I saw her, Adrianne Jones, a 16-year-old girl lying sprawled among the weeds. Her body was still, unnaturally still, her once vibrant life snuffed out in a brutal, senseless act. Her head was a mess of blood and matted hair, 2 bullet holes punched clean through her forehead, execution style. A deep dent in her skull told another story, a savage blow from something heavy, delivered with intent to kill. The blood had dried into the dirt, a dark halo framing her fragile form, her wide eyes frozen in a silent scream. I crouched beside her, my gloved hands hovering over the scene. The wounds were fresh, the violence raw. A trail of blood-stained grass stretched a few yards, as if she'd tried to crawl away, to escape the nightmare closing in. But she didn't make it far. The killer, or killers, had finished her off without mercy. Around her, the field was eerily quiet. No footprints, no tire tracks, just the wind whispering through the tall grass. It was as if the earth itself wanted to erase what had happened here. But I couldn't let it. This wasn't just a body. This was a girl with a family, a future, someone's daughter stolen in the night. I stood, my breath fogging in the frigid air, and scanned the horizon. Who could do this? A drifter? A psychopath lurking in the shadows? Or something closer, something personal? The questions gnawed at me, each one a splinter under my skin. I'd seen death before. Car accidents, bar fights gone wrong. But this was different. This was deliberate, cold, a calculated descent into darkness. My gut told me the truth was out there, buried in the details, waiting to be unearthed. I clenched my fists, vowing to find the monster responsible, no matter how deep I had to dig. Back at the station, her name echoed in my mind. Adrianne Jones, a sophomore at Mansfield High, a track runner, a kid with dreams. Now she was evidence, tagged and cataloged, her life reduced to a case file. The image of her lifeless body burned into my memory, a haunting promise that this wouldn't end here. Little did I know the horror was just beginning, a tale of jealousy, betrayal, and a twisted love that would shake this quiet town to its core. As I stood over Adrianne Jones's body that December morning, I couldn't fathom the mind behind such an act. But months later, when the pieces fell into place, I met the killers, Diane Zamora and David Graham. They weren't the hardened criminals I'd imagined. No rap sheets, no shadowy pasts. They were kids, barely out of high school, with futures so bright they'd blind you. She was an honor student bound for the Naval Academy. He was a track star headed to the Air Force Academy. On paper, they were the American dream. In reality, they were a nightmare. I first heard their names in September 1996, when the case cracked open like a rotten egg. But to understand why Adrianne died, I had to dig into their heads. And what I found chilled me to the core. They met in 1991, volunteering at the Civil Air Patrol, a pair of overachievers bonded by ambition and something darker. By August 1995, they were dating, and within a month, they'd announced their engagement. To their families, it was young love. To me, it was the start of an obsession that festered into madness. Diane Zamora was the spark. Raised in a strict religious home, she prized purity above all else. She saw David as her soulmate, her one true constant in a chaotic world. Their bond wasn't just intense, it was suffocating. Witnesses said he'd drape his arm around her like a chain, even blocking her family from hugging her at graduation. She didn't mind. She thrived on it. She called their love pure, a sacred vow no one could touch. But when David confessed, truthfully or not, that he'd slept with Adrianne on November 4th, 1995, that purity shattered, and Diane snapped. Her reaction wasn't just jealousy, it was a descent into lunacy. In her confession, she described screaming, bashing her head against walls, clawing at the air like a trapped animal. She didn't want an apology, she demanded blood. "Kill her," she told David, her voice a venomous hiss. To her, Adrianne wasn't a person. She was a stain on their perfect union, a threat that had to be erased. It wasn't enough to punish David. She needed to purge the betrayal from their story. That's when I realized this wasn't love. It was a delusion, a warped fantasy where murder became their sacrament. David Graham was no innocent pawn, though. A polite, disciplined kid with a military haircut and yes sir manners. He seemed the last person to pull a trigger. But he was weak, malleable, and utterly enthralled by Diane. When she issued her ultimatum, he didn't flinch. In his confession, he wrote, "Diane's beautiful eyes played the strings of my heart effortlessly. I couldn't imagine life without her." He claimed the sex with Adrianne, later debunked, haunted him with guilt, but I saw through it. Whether it happened or not, he used it as fuel, feeding Diane's rage to prove his loyalty. He planned the kill, picked the spot, and carried it out. He wasn't forced, he was complicit, a willing disciple in her cult of two. Their psychology was a tangle of control and chaos. Diane dominated, her insecurity masked as devotion. David submitted, his obedience cloaked as love. Together, they built a world where Adrianne's death was justified, even noble. Reading their statements, I felt sick, not just at the act, but at how they convinced themselves it was right. "We said I love you after," David wrote, as if it sealed their bond. That's the horror. They didn't see a crime. They saw a ritual, and Adrianne paid the price for their twisted minds. When I reconstructed the night of December 3rd, 1995, it wasn't just another case file. It was a descent into a hell I couldn't unsee. I've handled murders before. Sloppy stabbings, drunken shootouts, crimes of desperation. But what Diane Zamora and David Graham did to Adrianne Jones wasn't impulsive or chaotic. It was methodical, savage, and soaked in a cruelty that gnaws at you long after the reports are filed. This wasn't just a killing. It was an annihilation, a deliberate erasure of a girl who'd done nothing to deserve it. It began with a lie, or maybe a truth. We'll never know for sure. David claimed he'd slept with Adrianne a month earlier, a fleeting betrayal that lit the fuse in Diane's warped mind. That confession, real or fabricated, set the stage for a night of horror. Around 10:30 p.m., David picked up the phone and dialed Adrianne's house. His voice was calm, disarming, a track teammate she trusted. "Hey, AJ, it's David. Want to go for a ride?" Her mother, Linda, heard him through the receiver, recognizing the polite kid from school. It was past the 10 p.m. curfew, but she let it slide, thinking it was harmless. Adrianne, full of youthful curiosity, slipped out her front door into the dark, sneakers silent on the pavement, unaware she was walking into a trap. David pulled up in his green Mazda Protégé, the engine humming softly. Adrianne climbed into the passenger seat, probably smiling, oblivious to the danger coiled in the hatchback. Diane was back there, crouched low, her breath shallow with anticipation, a dumbbell gripped tight in her hands. The plan was chilling in its simplicity. Lure Adrianne out, snap her neck, weigh her down with weights, and sink her into Joe Pool Lake. They'd rehearsed it in their heads, a twisted fantasy of cleansing their pure love. But murder isn't clean, and it doesn't bend to scripts. David drove them to a desolate stretch near Grand Prairie, where the road faded into shadow and the fields stretched out like a graveyard. The car rolled to a stop, headlights dimming into the night. Adrianne leaned back, maybe chatting about school or track, her guard down. That's when Diane struck. She burst from the hatchback, a silent fury, and grabbed for Adrianne's neck. The movies make it look easy, twist, snap, done, but real life is messier. Adrianne fought, her screams shattering the stillness, her hands flailing against Diane's grip. The car became a cage of chaos, grunts, thuds, the sound of flesh against metal as they wrestled. Diane's plan unraveled fast. She couldn't break Adrianne's neck. Too much resistance, too much life in that 16-year-old frame. Frustrated, she snatched the dumbbell and swung it down hard. The crack echoed inside the car as it smashed into Adrianne's skull, blood exploding across the passenger door, splattering the window in a grotesque arc. I saw that stain later, dried into the upholstery, a testament to her terror. Adrianne's body slumped, dazed, but she wasn't out. With a surge of adrenaline, she clawed her way free, shoving the door open and tumbling into the dirt. She ran, staggering through the field, blood streaming down her face, her breaths ragged and desperate. For a heartbeat, she had hope, a chance to escape the nightmare. But David wasn't about to let her go. Diane's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "You can't let her get away, David." He grabbed his Makarov 9mm, a cold piece of steel he kept close like a talisman, and bolted after her. I can imagine her now, Adrianne stumbling, her legs buckling under the weight of pain, her hands clutching at the grass as she fell. David loomed over her, a silhouette against the moonless sky. He didn't hesitate. 2 shots rang out. Pop, pop, the bullets tearing through her forehead, each one a death knell. Her body jerked once, then went still, a crumpled heap in the weeds. The brutality didn't end with her last breath. David sprinted back to the car, panting, his hands slick with sweat and guilt. The first words he spoke weren't of regret, but devotion. "I love you, baby. Do you believe me now?" Diane, her face smeared with Adrianne's blood, nodded and whispered, "Yes, I love you too." Then, as if snapping out of a trance, she added, "We shouldn't have done that, David." Shouldn't have? It was too late for second thoughts. They stripped off their bloody clothes, tossed them into a bag, and drove off, leaving Adrianne's body to the cold Texas night. A farmer found her the next day, her lifeless form a stark contrast to the vibrant girl she'd been hours before. What gets me isn't just the violence, it's the callousness. They didn't see Adrianne as a person with a family, a future. To them, she was an obstacle, a smudge on their delusional love story. The dumbbell, the gun, the chase. It was all so calculated, yet so sloppy, a mix of premeditation and panic. Rebuilding that night, I felt her fear, her fight, and it drove me to make sure they'd pay. This wasn't passion gone wrong. This was evil, plain and raw, and Adrianne bore its full weight. 9 months. That's how long Adrianne Jones's killer, or killers, walked free while her case sat like a stone in my gut. I'm Detective Alan Patton, and I've chased leads through dead ends before. But this one was different. It wasn't just the lack of evidence. It was the silence, the way the trail vanished into thin air. We had her body, the bullets lodged in her skull, the dumbbell's imprint on her head, but no witnesses, no suspects, nothing to point the finger. Every night, I'd see her face, those wide, lifeless eyes, and feel the weight of failure pressing down. We started strong. December 4th, 1995, the day she was found, we combed the field. Every blade of grass, every speck of dirt. The blood trail led back to the road, suggesting a car, but tire tracks were muddled by frost. The coroner confirmed 2 9mm shots and a blunt force blow, likely from a weight. I questioned David Graham early on. He was on her track team, a possible link. He sat across from me, all yes sir and polished manners, claiming he barely knew her. No polygraph, no red flags. His golden boy act fooled me. We let him go, and I kicked myself for it later. Weeks turned to months. We hauled in Brian McMillan, a 17-year-old Mansfield kid with a temper, after a tip pointed his way. He was cagey, but the evidence didn't stick. No blood, no gun, and he passed a polygraph with flying colors. Released. The case grew cold, files piling up with dead-end interviews and useless tips. I'd drive by that field sometimes, imagining her last moments, wondering if we'd ever crack it. The Jones family deserved answers, and I was coming up empty. Then, August 29th, 1996, the phone rang, a lifeline from Annapolis. Naval Academy officials reported a midshipman, Diane Zamora, bragging to her roommates about a murder. "We killed for love," she'd said, her voice casual, like she was recounting a party. My pulse quickened. I knew David was at the Air Force Academy, too close a coincidence. I booked a flight, landing in Maryland the next day. Diane sat in an interrogation room, 18 and stone-faced, her dark hair pulled tight. "It was a story I made up," she insisted, but her eyes darted, her hands twitched. She was hiding something. Meanwhile, a team hit Colorado to grill David. He held the line at first, all military poise, but the polygraph broke him. Needles spiked as he lied about Adrianne. Sweat beaded on his forehead. By September 4th, he cracked, typing out a confession that read like a horror script. The call, the car, the dumbbell, the shots. I flew back to Texas, met Diane again on September 6th at Grand Prairie HQ. She waved her rights, her voice flat as she recounted the same nightmare. Hiding in the hatchback, striking Adrianne, ordering David to finish it. Their stories matched down to the "I love yous," a sick echo of their bond. We moved fast. A search of David's Mansfield home turned up the Makarov 9mm, hidden in the attic, and dumbbells with faint blood traces. Diane's Mazda had blood on the passenger door. Adrianne's confirmed by DNA. The puzzle snapped together. A jealousy-fueled plot, executed with chilling precision. By September 6th, they were in custody, their academy dreams swapped for steel bars. The break came from their own hubris. Diane's boasts, David's collapse under pressure. It took 9 months, but we got them. Justice wasn't swift, but it was certain, and I'd be damned if I let Adrianne's voice stay silent. When the gavel fell in 1998, Diane and David got life. Parole possible in 2036. But for Adrianne's family, there's no parole from grief. I stood in court as her father, Bill, choked out, "We'll never know what she could have become." Her mother, Linda, once wished the killer would rot with guilt. She didn't get that. Diane and David blamed each other, deflecting remorse like it was a game. The Joneses lost a daughter. The community lost its innocence. This case sticks with me not just for the horror, but for what it teaches. Jealousy isn't love, it's a poison. Diane and David were golden kids, but their twisted minds turned ambition into ashes. Adrianne's death wasn't fate. It was a choice, a brutal one we can prevent. Teach your kids to see obsession for what it is. Dangerous, deadly. Her voice is gone, but her story screams a warning. Don't let darkness win.